it's my pleasure and to introduce you to the panel guests, presenters today. I will start from the far end. Chancellor Vivian Poy. Chancellor Poy is the Chancellor of University of Toronto and also the Senator of Canada. Professor Eric Fong, who is a professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. Professor Henry Yu, who is the professor at University of British Columbia and also University of California, Los Angeles. And then finally, her Honorable Olivia Chow. I know Olivia Chow as Olivia, who from a long time ago, she is a member of the Parliament of Canada. So I would like to ask each presenter to present about 15 minutes, and I think I would like to ask Olivia. Okay.
Thank you, Ito. Yeah, I actually do know Ito for, I don't know, at least 23 years. Yeah, go way back.
Yeah. Kindergarten.
Old friend. Well, yeah. Her, not so good. The idea of a new Silk Road evokes up images of a road to wealth, riches, and opportunities. Fabulous images and wonderful dreams. Wealth and opportunity. And that was the dream of Jiang Quan in 200 BC when he began traveling out of China to trade silk, opening up the first Silk Road. And that was the dream of Marco Polo in 1200 AD when he went in the other direction, seeking the fabled riches of the East. And then there was the dream of Christopher Columbus in 1492 when he was looking for a faster route to the east and tripped over North America instead, the dream of wealth and opportunity. And that is, of course, the dream of every immigrant, past, present, and future, in every country in the world. Opportunity. And for so many people seeking a new country, that is what Canada seems to offer. Amazing wealth, amazing opportunity. That was why my parents came. They made the journey from Hong Kong to Canada when I was 13. They were looking for opportunity for me, their daughter, and they were looking to give me a better life. 35 years later, and here I am on a panel with these esteemed guests. While I've not achieved great wealth and riches, I have a successful political career, made a very comfortable income, and for some people they consider me a small role model, first Asian-born woman elected in municipal government in Toronto, first Chinese-Canadian in Ontario serving, for women anyway, in Parliament. So this is one of those heartwarming success stories. I followed the new Silk Road in my childhood with my parents, and look how far I've traveled. I've been elected to office in this country, a pretty remarkable dream for me. But let us wake up from the dream and look at some of the present day realities. It would be wrong to see me as the poster girl for immigrant today, from Hong Kong or anywhere else. It would be wrong. There's something wrong with this picture. The poster girl has a face, and she's a child, and she's poor. I'm going to talk about that child today, and I'm going to speak about child poverty. Sort of quite connected. A national disgrace in this country which has so much wealth. I'm going to talk about the Silk Road from the other side of the street, where the road is crumbling, where the silk is unraveling, and where the fabric of our society is beginning to fray. The new Silk Road is hitting a dead end here in Canada for a lot of people. You don't have to travel very far from here to find poverty in Canada. Child poverty exists here in this wealthy country, here in this wealthy province, here in this wealthy city, and here at the doorstep of this great university. It's the reality of the lives of the people who may push dim sum cart in Chinatown, work as cashiers in a corner store, sweep the floors of this building, these different buildings here in the middle of the night. And because of this reality, 1 in every 6 children in Canada lives in poverty. 1 in every 6. In Toronto, the level is even higher, 1 in every 3. Poverty is more concentrated in urban areas where people may find jobs, but also higher costs of living. And that's the sad reality in Canada. For all children, 1 in 6 lives in poverty. For visible minorities, the figure climbs to over 30%. 1 in 3. For all immigrants, 40% lives in poverty. So, by the way, do 40% of Aboriginal children. And for recent immigrants, those who have immigrated here in the last 10 years, the number is even more heartbreaking. It is 49%. That is half. 1 out of every children of recent immigrants lives in poverty. That's Stats Can figure. This is a national disgrace. It's a disgrace, not a dream. It is the reality that immigrants are beginning to realize, and it's getting worse. What is even more disgraceful is that many of these immigrants have very good qualifications and had a better existence in their home countries before they came here. But we don't recognize their credentials, and even though we need doctors, nurses, dentists, engineers, technicians, we don't provide adequate settlement services anymore. Most of these parents are working. We're talking about working families here. 1/3 of these families have at least 1 parent in full-time job. The vast majority have 1 or 2 parents with several part-time jobs. Not a lot of time left for the kids. But on minimum wage, the income of these families may be about $17,000 a year. And what can a family of 4 afford? When you pay rent and heat and food, what's left? Not much of a dream and not much silk in that road. And so much for the fabled riches of the West. So I want to encourage you to find out for yourself. Check out the website campaign2000.ca. That's Canada's leading anti-poverty group. It's dedicated to making child poverty history. The reason for this name, you might know, Campaign 2000, has special resonance for me. In November 1989, Ed Broadbent, the former leader of the NDP, made a resolution in the House of Commons. It said, and I quote, "This House seeks to achieve the goal of eliminating poverty among Canadian children by year 2000. And that resolution won unanimous support from every member of Parliament, every party. But we're far from achieving it. In fact, they've gone worse. We saw a decade of cutbacks, whether it's the provincial or the federal government. We know there are things we can do. So just yesterday, Campaign 2000 held a press conference to draw attention to this issue. They're calling on the Ontario government and the federal government to take action. And there are 5 clear measures. Childcare. Build high quality, accessible, affordable childcare here with the spaces working families need. Social assistance. Restore social assistance to the level that helps people get above poverty line. And stop calling back the child benefit from families that have social assistance. They happen to be the one that need it most, by the way. A minimum wage. Increase the minimum wage to $10 an hour. Build in an inflation index and make it work by enforcing employment standards to stop exploitation and discrimination. And a lot of these recent immigrants happen to work in these kind of jobs. Affordable housing. Increase funding to invest in affordable housing and address homelessness. And I tell you, when I've been in municipal council all these years, the number of new immigrants that come to me and say that they can't make payment is tremendous. They can't find affordable housing. It's really difficult for them. And number 5, this is an interesting one, invest in improved services for new immigrants and to get recognition for qualification and credentials, among other things. For the NDP, these measures are high priority for us. You know that. That's our platform. They're in our soul. I am in our caucus given some special responsibility. I'm the NDP critic for children and youth, with a special focus on child poverty, and I'm also the deputy critic for immigration, with a focus in Toronto. As a new member of Parliament, I'm determined to ensure that we finally live up to our resolution and commitment to end child poverty. I've been working for this for over 20 years, seeing too many broken promises along the way. And for over a decade, there was no new federal or provincial investment. We saw some action in minority government last year, and we see declining investment in service for immigrants. So, result, we have child poverty, cycles of poverty, and it's really hard for children to break free. We may believe they can, but that belief is rooted in the history, in the realities of the 70s and 80s. It's gone a lot worse. We see youth crime, violence, we see poverty, despair, and this is the price to pay when we neglect social fabric. When the silk begins to unravel, when the road begins to crumble, that's what's happened. But there are rewards when the right investments are made. That's what I'm focused on. So let's focus on the positive. We can get results to make child poverty history. And then yesterday's dreams can become tomorrow's reality for immigrants to this country. That would be the best contribution of this particular immigrant from Hong Kong can make, to help create a future where a future 13-year-old arrived in this country can face the boundless opportunities that I saw those years ago. A country where everything is possible. I know we can do it. We have the riches here, and there's plenty of silk. We just have to weave it together. So that's our challenge, and let's rise to it. Thank you for letting me be the speaker today.
This seminar. Well, you just heard Olivier. She speaks like a politician, but I'm going to speak like a historian. I find the title of this discussion, The New Silk Road, intriguing. How does one compare Hong Kong immigrants? The first thing that comes to mind is the Roman reference to the Chinese as the Silk People, or Seres, in 53 BC, when they first came across silk fabric during their campaign against the Parthians. So Silk Road, to me, at the present time, means the movement of people and trade of the Chinese in Hong Kong. Since Canada was the main destination of Hong Kong immigration in recent years, between 1990 and 1994, 57% of all immigrants from Hong Kong came to Canada. So the traffic could be perceived as the new Silk Road. Until recent years, all movement of people from China to the Western world had been either through Hong Kong or directly from Hong Kong. A lot of people are not aware of that because Hong Kong was the main port of immigration from China. And that was because since 1483 until July 1st, 1997, Hong Kong was a British colony. As an important port for shipping, Hong Kong was the port of embarkation for Chinese laborers who went abroad to work. Until recent years, those who emigrated from China were all from the coastal areas of South China because Guangzhou was the city open for trade with the West under the Qing dynasty. Hong Kong was also the main conduit for transfer of money from Chinese laborers working abroad to their families in China. Please note that up to the first part of the 20th century, there wasn't such a thing as passports or visas. Anyone from anywhere in the world who wished to go to any country to work was able to do so as long as the passage was paid. The first major wave of Chinese migrants came to Canada because of the gold rush in BC in the 1850s. Initially, they came to Canada from San Francisco, where they had gone before because of the gold rush there. My own great-grandfather also went to San Francisco at that time. They were joined by migrants from China. A few of them made their money in gold mining because the Chinese were not allowed to work the mines until the white miners had moved on. Most of them ended up working as ranch cooks, houseboys, market gardeners, or opening laundries and restaurants. The next wave of Chinese migrants who came to Canada at the end of the 1870s were laborers brought in by contractors to build the most difficult section of the CPR in British Columbia. Some were railwaymen who had worked in California, but the majority of them were poor peasants from South China. The reason for the push factor of Chinese emigration from Guangdong province was a large increase in population in the 19th century, and there just wasn't enough land to feed the people, so many left in order to make a living. When the CPR was completed in 1885, the Dominion government tried to stop more Chinese from entering Canada, and a head tax of $50 was imposed in 1885. This did not discourage Chinese from entering Canada, so the head tax was increased to $100 in 1900 and to $500 in 1903. Even this amount was not enough of a deterrent, and in order to keep Canada a white country, Chinese immigration was stopped by the Immigration Act of 1923, also known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. All this has been very much in the news in recent months, especially during our federal election. With the imposition of the head tax and Chinese exclusion, Canada had followed the policy of the United States towards the Chinese. The Chinese communities were mainly made up of poor laborers, since the wealthy and the educated did not leave China, with a few exceptions of enterprising merchants and school teachers who taught at the Chinese schools abroad. For that reason, the image Canadian society had of the Chinese were that they were poor, dirty, and willing to accept lower pay than white workers. Up to this point, it is important to note that there were very few Chinese women in Canada. This was primarily due to the Chinese tradition that women were expected to stay home to look after their mother-in-laws, raise their children, and tend to the graves of the ancestors. Besides, the men were only abroad with the hope of making enough money to send home to help to support their families and to retire back in their villages in later years. There were some men who wanted to bring their wives, but the expense was prohibitive to the majority of laborers. Besides, they were living in conditions not suitable for couples. The few Chinese women in Canada were mostly wives of merchants, school teachers, and ministers of the church, or their household servants. For that reason, the Chinese communities were known as bachelor societies. There were few Chinese children born in Canada, and they were denied Canadian citizenships. Between 1923 and 1947, because of Chinese exclusion, only a handful of Chinese entered Canada. After the Second World War, Chinese Canadian veterans, Chinese community leaders such as Jean Lum, as well as other human rights activists, lobbied the federal government to repeal Chinese exclusion from the Immigration Act and, at the same time, to give citizenship to Chinese residents in Canada. This opened the door to further Chinese immigration as well as family reunification of Chinese Canadians. So where does Hong Kong come in? Hong Kong remained the main port of embarkation for the Chinese from mainland China who wished to emigrate abroad. Right after the Second World War, the Civil War in China was a major push factor in Chinese emigration, while the change in Canadian immigration policy particularly with respect to family reunification, was a major pull factor. When the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, with the subsequent closing of the Chinese border to the outside world, Hong Kong remained the only port for those in China who wished to emigrate, if they were able to cross the border to Hong Kong. One hears of stories of escape over the border in Sumdan, or by water on leaky boats, and a few actually swam to Hong Kong. The majority who managed to get to Hong Kong stayed and became citizens there. I came to Canada in 1959 on a student visa, and at that time there were very few students of Chinese descent in Canadian universities. We saw more Chinese faces starting in the late 1960s. With the introduction of the point system in 1967, immigrants to Canada could apply based on their education, skills, and training, not just family connections. Many students from Hong Kong started enrolling in Canadian universities because upon graduation, if they were able to get employment, they could apply for citizenships. Since the late 1960s, an increasing number of women with skills were able to apply to immigrate on their own instead of having to be dependents of men as before. By the end of the 1970s, with an increasing number of educated immigrants in the Chinese-Canadian communities, the status of the communities was raised in the eyes of mainstream Canada. I believe it was around this time that the Federation of Chinese-Canadian Professionals was formed by immigrants from Hong Kong. Diplomatic relations were established between Canada and Hong Kong in 1971. When our former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau visited China in 1973, an agreement was signed which enabled close relatives of Chinese Canadians to immigrate to Canada. Chinese immigrants to Canada, whether they were originally from China or from Hong Kong, all came through Hong Kong, many having to stay there for a number of years for the immigration process. Statistically, according to Citizen and Immigration Canada, some of these immigrants may have been listed as from China because that was their country of birth. Immigration specifically from Hong Kong did not gain prominence until the 1980s. Many of these immigrants were born in China and over the years had obtained Hong Kong passports. Now I mention Hong Kong passports is because that it was due to the eventual return of sovereignty of Hong Kong to China, the British government made the distinction between British passports and Hong Kong passports for the fear that British Isles would be flooded with Hong Kongers. Well, that couldn't happen anyway because it's very difficult to make a living in Britain. The negotiation between Britain and China over the sovereignty of Hong Kong caused jitters in the minds of many Hong Kong residents. By the end of the 1980s, because of the events at Tiananmen Square and the imminent return of Hong Kong back to China, many of the residents applied to immigrate to different countries. This was possible because Hong Kong was experiencing a period of economic prosperity, and immigrants were in good financial positions to make the move. In order to attract investment capital, Canada, like the other immigrant-receiving countries, introduced the business and entrepreneur categories for immigrants with business backgrounds and with high net worth. Between 1990 and 1994, almost 173,000 Hong Kong immigrants landed in Canada. The volume of annual immigration peaked at over 44,000 in 1994 alone. Visibly, there were Chinese everywhere in the major cities, and malls reminiscent of Hong Kong started springing up. Everywhere, one could hear Cantonese being spoken. During this period, we saw high-end retail stores hiring Cantonese-speaking staff. Canadian corporations started advertising in Chinese to attract these wealthy immigrants. The status of the Chinese-Canadian communities had moved from professional to super rich. It is only in recent years that Chinese immigrants enter Canada directly from mainland China instead of via Hong Kong. In 1998, there was a modest increase in immigration directly from mainland China, as compared to the large numbers from Hong Kong. A major shift started to occur in 1995 with the gradual decline of immigrants from Hong Kong and the gradual increase of immigrants from mainland China. By 2001, less than 2,000 immigrants arrived here directly from Hong Kong. In recent years, what is very apparent is that there is an increasing number of Mandarin-speaking immigrants, whereas they all used to speak Cantonese. Today, immigrants from mainland China are the largest group of immigrants arriving in Canada annually. I want to point out this demographic may soon be overtaken by immigrants from South Asia. Upon reflection, how has immigration from Hong Kong influenced Canadian society? I'll go back to the comparisons between the old and the new Silk Roads. First, the movement of people declined as in the case of the old Silk Road and Hong Kong immigration to Canada. Number two, trade declined along the old Silk Road because the Sea Silk Road proved to be a much easier route for trade by the 7th century AD. As in the case of Hong Kong investments, they're no longer pouring into Canada, as in the later part of the 1980s and the first part of the 1990s. And of course, since then, there has been a large number of return migration because of better economic opportunities in Asia. What are the long-term results? In both cases, we have the introduction of new races, cultures, and religions into China from the old Silk Road and into Canada from the new Silk Road. Cave paintings along the old Silk Road showed peoples of different ethnic backgrounds other than Central and East Asians. Interestingly, the most important commodity carried along this route was not silk, but religion. Islam was introduced. Even more importantly, Buddhism became a dominant religion in China. Immigration to Canada has the same long-term effects. For that reason, we have become the most multicultural country in the world. With the intermingling of peoples, we have incorporated their cultures and faiths. Immigrants from Hong Kong, whether they remained in Canada or have returned to Hong Kong, their influence in Canadian society will forever be part of Canadian culture. Students from Hong Kong have brought their competitiveness to our schools, and the food culture in Canada is greatly influenced by Chinese cuisine. Religions, such as Buddhism, are increasing in influence. What is even more important to Canada as a whole, the immigrants from Hong Kong have helped to build a bridge between Canada and the ever-growing economically powerful China, which will forever benefit Canada as a country. Thank you.
Going to discuss in the next 15 minutes is to highlight or to discuss a few issues related to the contemporary. One thing I would like to talk about, if we still use the analogy of Silk Road, I would like to look at those who are walking on Silk Road, how much they are connected to the home country and how much they are connected to the new country. especially given the economic globalization and the advancement of technologies, we always heard in the news that a lot of new immigrants, especially when we talk about immigrants from Hong Kong, they like to travel back and forth. They maintain a very close contact back home to Hong Kong. So what I want to do here is to find out exactly how much do this group of immigrants they maintain their contact back home. And if this is the case, how much they participate in the Canadian social activities. So these are the two questions we'd like to address. To give you a little bit theoretical background of my discussion is that being trained as a sociologist and focusing on the issues of race and ethnicity and immigration, the major perspective, of course, we would like to discuss is the assimilation perspective, which is largely developed by the Chicago School at the beginning of the last century, drawn from the experience of the European immigrants in the United States during that period of time. And the major idea of the assimilation perspective suggested that when immigrants first come to a new country, they don't know the place, they don't know the language, they will stick together in the ethnic community. Once they stay in the country longer, they accumulate the resources, they know the country better, they develop better networks, then they will move out and mix with other groups and become with a happy ending that everyone become one group. And the whole idea is that, at the end of the assimilation, supposed to be every groups or every individuals, they will share a common cultural life. But then this idea has been challenged in recent years by social scientists in all fronts. And not going to discuss in the details about all these challenges. But then one particular effort that has been made, I would like to draw your attention, is by a recent publication by Albert and Lee. And what they did is they rediscovered the work, so-called rediscover, the work of Shibutani and Kwan that was written in the middle of the last century to talk about the ethnic integration process. But one thing very interesting, what they are trying to discuss about the group relations, especially related to immigrations, they suggested that in order to fully understand of integration, we should not focusing on the cultural aspect. Instead, we should look at integration from a perspective of ethnic stratification. In other words, that when we think about integration, we should look at it as the outcome is the equality among groups. In a sense that we should talk about, say, for example, the income similarities among groups, the educational achievement among groups. So those are the things that we should focus on, but not about the culture. But then, since the publication of this work, there was a discussion, and of course, one major comments on this approach was raised by a sociologist, Wardinger, also at UCLA, and he asked a question that, all right, even though we would like to understand integration from an ethnic stratification perspective, but how can this group reach to the end, and how can they reach to a common level in all aspects of their social lives? So he suggested that maybe something is missing that we would like to go back and reinvestigate. And here I would like to draw a work that's done by Doug Massey and his associate, that what they argue is that for a group, in order to fully integrate, the most important thing is the interaction, that is the social contact. No matter what kind of integration we are talking about, we have to reduce it back to interaction. And what they suggested that is the spatial integration. That means we may meet people in the university, we may meet people in the grocery store. After all, when we talk about integration, it's about interaction. So by learning about how they interact, or the patterns of the interaction, actually can help us to go to the micro level of understanding the integration of immigrant groups. But this approach, also in recent years, is challenged by another perspective, which is usually we refer to the transnationalism. What they are arguing is that the assimilation model is old, is outdated, is no use anymore for us to understand the contemporary situation. The reason is because of the advancement of the technology, the globalization, financial capital moving back and forth, and human migration is all-time high, people moving from one location to another. So in order to fully understand this, we should actually to look at the movement and the settlement at the same time, that people maintain their contact across the border. They immigrant especially, they maintain multiple contacts between with the friends back home at the same time with their friends in the new country. So it's a much more complicated process. It's not like a zero-sum relationship as described by the assimilation model. So with all this understanding, what we are going to do in the next few minutes is to explore the transnational ties of the Hong Kong immigrant groups as compared to other Chinese immigrant groups. And also we want to explore the participation level of this group in the local organization. That means in the organizations in Canada. And this is drawn from a recent study that I just completed, is to look at the immigration and new economy, which I collect about 15,000 cases in the last fall, and about 300 cases of Chinese ethnic origin. And here's one of the questions I asked here, is that I asked, first of all, we look at the transnational linkage. I asked in the last 2 years, how many times did you visit your home country? And I look at those immigrants from Hong Kong, and immigrants from mainland China, and the Chinese immigrants from other parts of the world, as well as we compare with the Canadian-born Chinese. As you can see from the left panel, the left graph, you see the majority of Chinese, actually they said that in the last 2 years, they did not visit their home country. For the Canadian-born population, we are referring to the parental home country. So, even, the group we're always referring to, the Hong Kong immigrants, they always travel back and forth. But here the data suggested that about 50% of them, they said that they didn't visit the home country in the last 2 years. And if they did, you see that most of them only pay a visit 1 time or 2 times in the last 2 years. Then we also want to ask the questions, among all these travels, how many of them were related to the businesses? Because we're always saying that a lot of the Hong Kong immigrants or the immigrants from Asia in general, they hold a business back home and then they travel back and forth. And again, you see that if you look at the left panel, those who said that they said they make the trip, but then a lot of them they said it's not related to business. Especially if, well, for the Hong Kong immigrants, which is the far left chart at the bar, and you see that still about over 90% they said that their trip were not related to business at all. And so you see that here, if people returning back to the home country, a lot of them is not about business. It's mainly for the personal reason. Then we also asked if maybe it's because traveling may cost a lot, may not everyone afford to do so, and so we asked them, how often do you contact your friends by telephone in the last 2 years? Again, if you look at the right side, you see that quite a large proportion or percentage of immigrants from Hong Kong, about 50%, they said they never contact their friends by telephone in the home country in the last 2 years. But then for immigrants from mainland China, we see that the larger percentage of them, they have some kind of contact with their friends by telephone back home. That only close to 30% of them, they said they never did so in the last 2 years. And among those who did the contact, you see that quite a large proportion of them, they maintain the contact maybe 2 or 3 times a week or once a week. In particular, I would like to draw your attention on the contrast between those immigrants from Hong Kong and the mainland China. And you see that those from mainland China seems to have a more contact with their friends by telephone. Then we maybe, still using the telephone may cost us some money. Some people may not willing to do so. So we asked them, how about email? in the last 2 years, how often did you contact friends by email? Again, we see that quite a large proportion of them, almost all groups, over 50% suggested that they did not have contact with friends by email in the home country. And but then again, if you look at those who have the contact, quite a substantial of those immigrants from mainland, they do so, as contrast to those immigrants from Hong Kong. Instead of, besides contacting their friends, we also want to know, well, some immigrants, they also would like to know what's going on back home. So we asked the question, is that in the last 2 years, how often did you listen to the online radio from home country? Again, we see that quite a substantial number of them, they said they did not. And among those who do, you see that quite a large proportion of them are immigrants from Hong Kong. And want to draw your attentions about 6 to 7% of immigrants from Hong Kong. They said that they listen to the online radio from their home place about almost daily. So that's a pretty very frequent usage of the online radio. And then we also asked them, how often did you read online newspaper in the last 2 years from your home country? Again, quite a large proportion of them, they don't. But then if you look at the contrast between immigrants from Hong Kong and immigrants from China, we see that immigrants from China are more likely to read the online newspaper from home. Now we ask about, if you don't read your newspaper from home, don't listen the online radio, then how often do you read the local ethnic newspaper? Again, it's another source for you to learn about your home country. Here is a very drastic difference. We see that quite a substantial proportion of immigrants from Hong Kong and mainland China, they read the local newspaper. And among them, you see that the Hong Kong immigrants are more likely to read the local ethnic newspaper daily. Almost close to 50% of them, they read the Chinese newspaper daily, as compared to the 25% of the immigrants from China. So you see that here is quite interesting that the Hong Kong immigrant more likely to purchase the local ethnic newspaper to read, to find out what happened back home, but the immigrants from the mainland China more likely to use the online newspaper to find out what's happened back home. Then the other side of the story, we want to find out how much they participate in the new country. And so because we find that most of them actually they don't have much contact back home, or to find out what happened back home. And here we see that we ask them how often they participate in the ethnic or immigrant organizations. All groups below 8%, so it's very low percentage. Then we ask about the sport club and sport team, very low percentage, except the Canadian-born Chinese. They have over 20%. They participate in some kind of sport club and team. Participate in hobby club, again, is very low percentage. Cultural club, again, is very low percentage. And we see that the Canadian-born seems to be a higher percentage, but still pretty low. And service club, again, is pretty low, below 7% of all groups. Community organization, again, very low. Youth organization, again, we see the same pattern, very low. Job-related association is still very low, but then the Canadian-born Chinese a little bit higher, but still we see that very low percentage participation. Political and citizens group, again, we see that less than 2% of them they do participate. Only for the Canadian-born Chinese, but the rest is zero. None of them they participate in the political and citizen group. So what can we conclude here? That is very interesting. From the transnational perspective, the transnational activities among all Chinese groups, in fact, are pretty low level. But then we find that the participation level of immigrants from mainland seems to be a little bit higher from the immigrants from Hong Kong. And in terms of the participation in the local activities, what do we find here is extremely low level. But then we find maybe the Canadian-born Chinese a little bit higher. So in other words, we see that a very interesting picture that is a low participation in both the transnational and the local activities of the immigrants from no matter from Hong Kong or from mainland China. So of course, this data require more analysis, but it raised the question. It's suggested do the Chinese this is the data collected from Toronto. So the Chinese in Toronto, they are experiencing certain types of integration pattern that have not been able to capture by the previous literature. That is low level in all aspects, but we haven't been able to find out what are the high level of social participation in what area. I guess I'm going to stop it here and just would like to flow the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Get my slides up. Toronto. Some of what I'm going to say is going to sound different from what Senator Poi and Senator Fong says, and of course, any differences are just merely imaginary. We don't disagree. We all agree on everything, but it's going to sound like we disagree on a couple of things. But first off is I'm going to throw out a term, Pacific Canada. And what I mean by that is not Asian Canada or Asian Canadian or a sense of Asians in Canada, but a new way of conceptualizing, to me, what the history and the present and the future of not just Hong Kong migration, but of the connections between Canada as a society in North America and other societies in North America with those across the Pacific. So it's a kind of way of conceptualizing the Trans-Pacific. Now, why do we need to do that? Because I think that we've been blinded by national conceptions of, quote, immigration, whereas I'm a migration scholar. I think of people moving, I think of objects moving, I think of ideas moving, and they move in all kinds of directions. And for me, Pacific Canada encompasses not just the Trans-Pacific Asian migrants, Chinese, Korean, South Asian, Punjabi, Sikh, who have come to Canada, but also the British and the Canadian civil servants and military personnel who went the other way, in constant motion, constant circularity. And the word circularity to me is key. These are circular migrations. They are not all just one point to another and that's the end of it. Okay? And I'm not just talking about people, but also objects and ideas. Okay, so where does Hong Kong and Hong Kong migration lie, both historically then and now? A couple things. One, that Hong Kong you can think of as from gateway, and this is Senator Poi also mentioned this already. Hong Kong has been a gateway initially, in the late 19th into the early 20th century, the gateway of Chinese from Guangdong province to not just Canada, but to the United States and to a number of settler colonies, European settler colonies in Australia, New Zealand, also South America, Central America. We know this. If you yourself are Cantonese, you've got relatives all over the world. And the reason why is because Hong Kong is a gateway for migration outwards, mostly laboring migration, as Senator Poi pointed out. Okay, 19th, 20th century, gateway of immigration. Both then and now, migration was highly circular, which meant that young men left, often single, tried to make money out of what I call an economy of relative location. If you can make money here, send it back, it goes farther back there, then send it back there. If you can move a cheap good from one place to another and sell it for more, then move it. Migration was based upon the economics of relative location. So what seemed like poverty in Canada, low wages, could leverage much more at home. And so they left wives at home. One of the arguments about the discriminatory legislation in Canada and the US is that they couldn't bring their women. And the interesting thing is, Chinese migrants weren't bringing their women even when there wasn't discriminatory legislation. Same in Southeast Asia. There was not discriminatory legislation. Guess what they did? They left their wives and kids at home. The reason why is economics of relative location, as well as a number of other factors about home. But the interesting thing is, between 1933 and 1967, these are rough years. I'm just throwing, I don't really care about exact dates. But let's just say around the time of the Japanese invasion of China to about 1967 reforms, you had a weird aberration. The circularity was cut off by war and by a lack of some of the transportation technologies that were already making a Pacific region. So the weird point is then, not now. It's not a new globalization, it's a re-globalization. As an historian, I think it's really important to remember that. Okay. Now, Hong Kong became an entrepot for Southeast Asia, it always was, and a destination for refugees. Again, Senator Poi mentioned this. After the PRC took over what is now China, Hong Kong became a point of refugees. And it was the first point when people started to consider Hong Kong home. And so the reason why you have this idea of Hong Kong migration now, as if Hong Kong was the home rather than just a thoroughfare, is because Hong Kong started to become home for many of the refugees who went to Hong Kong. And that's a key point, because if you think about the circularity, and you think about the networks have been the same networks. Steamships from Hong Kong to Vancouver, airplane to Hong Kong to Vancouver. What's the difference? A little faster? It's the same route. Okay? And the routes were being followed. All right, let me just talk a little about rhythms of migration in this area. We often connect up Asian migration of all types to the US with Canada. And I think if you just take a quick look, I don't know if it's possible to see it, but let me just, 1850 gold rush, US 1858 gold rush. Some of the same Chinese were coming up. Right? 1860s and 70s railroads, 1870s railroads in Canada. Guess what? Same Chinese. They didn't come straight from China, many of them. They just came up through Oregon and Washington State. 1882 Exclusion Act. Okay. The hidden secret of Chinese Exclusion Act is it actually it cut off further migration, but the circular networks and smuggling and continual new networks continued. The secret of the rising national sovereignty over migration is it wasn't very effective. It's the first visas, it's the first what we might call passports. Senator Boy said they didn't exist back then, but you know who were the first people to be taking pictures of? Chinese. 1885. Now, the Canadians did it differently. They said, you know, instead of cutting them off, it doesn't work anyways, let's just charge them a year's salary, which is what $50 was. Didn't cut off migration, but what it did was it made it a cost-benefit analysis if you're a migrant. You got to pay a year's wages, but maybe you can make it back still. And people continue to pour through. And in fact, one of the things they poured through was to come to Canada and go to the US. Right? And so the Border Patrol, the thing, there's now Homeland Security, and guess who were they trying to stop at the Canada-US border first? Chinese. And then when they moved their operations down to the US-Mexican border, guess who were they trying to stop? Not Mexicans, Chinese. 1924 National Origins Act in the US cut off almost all migration from Asia. Formally, guess what? 1924 to about 1930, the Chinese kept coming illegally. The Depression had more to do with cutting off trans-Pacific migration than laws did. 1923, Chinese exclusion in Canada, same thing. Okay. 1943, exclusion overturned. World War II, an important mark. 1947, Canada grants citizenship. Okay. Immigration Act in 65, guess what? Point system, new waves of Asian. Guess what we did in 67? Same thing. 75, fall of Saigon, created a whole wave of what were called political refugees, Sino-Vietnamese, especially in the boat people wave. But guess what? The overwhelming majority of those boat people were ethnic Chinese. Okay? And so you had a parallel there. Now, where did we go weird in Canada? We started to cherry-pick well-off, educated Hong Kong Chinese. The U.S. tried to follow, but they've got these problems like constitutions and stuff, which limit their ability to go cherry-pick rich people and others. Okay, so that's a provocative comment. Let me throw a. 2007 is coming up. It's 2006. Let me just give you a kind of way to conceive of this so that it's easier to remember. Next year is the 100th anniversary of the 1907 anti-Chinese riots in 1907, where a large number of people rioted against Chinese. Now, we called it the anti-Chinese riots, but really it was anti-Punjabi Sikh, anti-Japanese, anti-Chinese riot. It began in Bellingham across the border as an anti-Punjabi Sikh riot to clear the Punjabi Sikhs out of the lumber mills. Worked so well, they said, let's take it across the border and let's do it to the Chinese and the Japanese. They were busting up Chinatown in the summer. You know, the Asiatic Exclusion League were the fellows who were organizing this. And it took so long in Chinatown that by the time they got to Little Tokyo, 3 blocks away on Powell Street, the Japanese had armed themselves and stopped them. So we don't know this as the Japanese riot or the anti-Japanese riot because the Japanese stopped them. Okay. So 100 years since that, and I think of this as a kind of way just to remember that it's a 100th anniversary of a certain kind of white supremacy, which was about keeping white Canada forever. Right? White Australia at the same time. You could say white United States, except that's redundant historically. But there was an attempt by settlers, European settlers, to come in and say the Chinese are taking our jobs. In fact, they were taking the Chinese jobs because the Chinese had created many of the lumbering and fishing and agricultural industries that were there before the Europeans got there. So white supremacy and white settler nationalism and white supremacy in that period is really about the displacement of the Chinese because they were there first. That's why they built the railroads. Everybody ever think of the irony that you build the railroads, bring people from the East Coast that are doing this too, and they send their kids to Canada? Why? Because it's cheap education in comparison. And the secret here is, I have students who say, if you're a mediocre student, Canada's a great place to go. Because if you're in Seoul, really tough to get through the exam system. Right? To get to the University of Seoul, really hard. So your parents, they just watch you about you're 12 years old and you're going, our kid's a little, Send them to Canada. I'm not saying all Canadian students, but this is a prime consider when you have qualitative surveys of why people send their kids to Canada, because the kid might not make it over there, right? In the tough exam systems. And so Canada, it's also cheap. If you're a Canadian citizen, it's incredibly cheap to get higher education here. Astronaut families, the circularity, as I said, is returned. Now the interesting thing is it's the opposite. It used to be the men would move, work, send money back. Now what you do is you work over in the Asian side and send your family the other way. Economics of relative location. Because things have switched the other way. You can make more money in Asia, but it's more secure and safe to keep your wife and kids over on this side. Business entrepreneur, as was mentioned, the investment and immigrant program. You might think of this in two ways. One is the passport, the Canadian passport, wonderful thing to have, mobility. I just became a dual U.S.-Canadian citizen. I taught at UCLA for 10 years. Why did I become a dual U.S. citizen? Because I was leaving the U.S. and it would make it easier for me to move back into the U.S. ever. Not that I'm not a patriotic American, even though now I'm an American citizen. But what it is, the passport allowed me mobility. And if you think of the passport as a form of mobility, then Canadian citizenship is really, really useful and valuable. It's good value added. New head tax. Is it worth $250,000 to pay for a Canadian passport for you? And not only that, you get a bonus, throw in all your family? Yeah. Right? If you think about the old head taxes, like 1 year's wages, $250,000 now. Vancouver is Switzerland in particular. Toronto, I think, is a slightly different case, so I'll talk more about Vancouver because it's where I teach right now. It's where I was born and grew up. 1986 to 1996, the Chinese Canadian population of the city of Vancouver nearly doubled in one decade, from 70,000 to 143,000. It's even higher now. 1991, 28% of all adult migrants from Hong Kong held a university degree, much higher than the normal population in terms of general population. 23% of all the Hong Kong migrants in that decade came as business class, which meant they required a $250,000 investment. That's why I call it the new head tax. So in other words, 1/4 used that as a means in. And if we had more time, I'd show you all the stores and stuff in Vancouver where there's no customers because it didn't matter because you just needed to invest to get in. Right? High return rates. It was just in the newspapers yesterday, the Stats Can story. I don't know if you saw it, but the high return rates, particularly of males, 25 to 40. And if you don't take them into account as Canadians, then you've got a skewed picture of Hong Kong migration. Because you're getting the people who stay for whatever reason. Family reasons, they just don't like the hustle bustle of Hong Kong, they like playing tennis and sort of relaxing. It's also an indication of life sequence. My colleague David Lay and Audrey Kobayashi of Queens have done a wonderful survey on when people return and why. And what they get is, a lot of people want to make money somewhere else, but they want to retire here or they want their kids to go to school here. It's life cycle considerations as to when they would even think about putting themselves in that circular network. Okay, here's my, too bad all the pictures are gone. Okay, Hong Kong migration and circularity. So go back to that theme of circularity. What's the challenges? If we use Hong Kong migration not as an aberration, but as in fact the model for considering not just Pacific Canada, but Canada in general, what are the challenges? Well, for Revenue Canada, one is people are spending the most productive years somewhere else untaxed, right? So that's a policy consideration for Revenue Canada and for all of us all. But if you think about it in another way, as a challenge of indicating how are we going to reconceptualize Canada as a global society, as a place where being Canadian is in a global society, then I think we have some real challenges to confront and face. That's number 2. And that is, right now, our ideal of education for higher education as well as K-12 is the second generation. I'll throw out a provocative comment. You are more likely to be a good global citizen and to make money in a global marketplace if you come here as a 12-year-old rather than being born here. Why? Because you come as a 12-year-old, you're more likely to remain bilingual. You're more likely to have languages and a sense of yourself in the world. You've experienced childhood in some other place. You see the difference between Canada as a society and some other place. If you're born here, you're going to be monolingual. Okay? You're going to speak English only, and you're a remedial project in higher education. In other words, we have to spend inordinate resources to take you, a native-born Canadian, and make them useful as a global citizen. They're useless. I'm one of them. I am one of them. I was born in Vancouver. Right? My abilities as a bilingual speaker are severely limited because of that. Right? Now, what does that mean? It means that the 1.5 generation actually is the future of Canada, if we are serious about global citizenry. Now, global citizenry is an empty phrase to me. There is no such, what's the body that grants you global citizenry? You know, you've got a United Nations passport or something. Canadian citizenship, as I said, is a gold standard for mobility in the world. It means that if you're in Doctors Without Borders or some NGO like that, if you get in trouble, the Canadian embassy will save your butt, to use the right, right? That's a gold standard for mobility in the world and an ability to operate in the world for good and for ill, let's just say. And that's why the Canadian citizenship is so valuable. The passports are so valuable. So, who should we be mounting our... I think we underutilize the 1.5 generation as well as recent migrants. We aim, as I said, our education system at the remedial types, the ones who have been born here. And to tell you the truth, it's a poor investment in resources. We need to do a better job in some sense to think of Hong Kong migration as the model, both policy and historically wise, as the way to understand how Pacific Canada has always been. Now, I'm not saying that there's a prescription for all of Canada. I'll limit it rhetorically to Pacific Canada, what I call Pacific Canada, which exists all across the geography of Canada. It's here in Toronto, it's here all the way into St. John's and Halifax. Right? But I think that's the way to think about it, and I think that's the way also that I would say that's the future. I've been involved in a number of things, and I'll end here, sort of around what used to be or what could be called Asian Canadian studies, or looking at Asians in Canada. To me, that's, it's interesting, and I'm fascinated by that, but it's a little too limiting, because I think placing it, as I said, into this larger purview of a region, right, of the Pacific, of the Asia Pacific would be, you could call it Asia Pacific, but the Pacific region, where things are going back and forth constantly in a very circular manner, trade goods, ideas, people. That's the way to conceptualize this. And then you leave behind, in some sense, that fascination with assimilation, which is really a local politics and policy of incorporating someone for local reasons. Right? To me, the sociology in certain sense, as I think Professor Fong has pointed out, has been in the embrace of that Park assimilation school. That's what I wrote my first book on. But that's the problem. We've been in the embrace of this idea of incorporating them. And I think in some sense, if Canada is truly going to open up and take advantage of the resources we have, which is this human capital of people pouring in from all around the world, then we need to do a different thing. Thank you.